Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born on the 2nd of October 1869 in a quiet coastal town called Porbandar, in present-day Gujarat, India. The town was small, surrounded by the Arabian Sea and filled with narrow lanes, bustling markets, and the scent of spices that hung in the air. Gandhi's father, Karamchand Gandhi, was the Diwan, something like a chief minister, of the small princely state of Porbandar. His mother, Putli Bai, was deeply religious, gentle in nature, and full of compassion. She followed the principles of Vaishnavism, a branch of Hinduism, and also embraced elements of Jainism, which emphasized nonviolence, fasting, and self-discipline. These teachings would quietly take root in young Gandhi's heart, although he would not yet realize their full power. Gandhi was the youngest of 3 sons, and his childhood was unremarkable to anyone looking from the outside. He was shy, often keeping to himself, and not a particularly bright student by the standards of his school. But there was a certain spark in him, an ability to listen deeply, to reflect quietly, and to observe the world around him in a way that others did not. Even as a child, he was fascinated by stories of truth and courage. One such influence was the Hindu epic, the Ramayana. His mother would tell him tales from it, stories of Lord Rama's commitment to righteousness, no matter the cost. These tales began to shape Gandhi's early ideas of moral duty and truth. School life for young Mohandas was simple. He was not a troublemaker, and he rarely drew attention to himself. His grades were average, and his teachers described him as punctual and obedient, but timid. He loved to read stories of great heroes, both from Indian mythology and from other cultures. One story in particular, about the king Harish Chandra, who gave up his kingdom, his family, and his comfort just to uphold the truth, struck Gandhi deeply. The story made such a mark on him that he began to see truth not just as a moral guideline, but as something worth sacrificing everything for. But even in this quiet childhood, there were moments of struggle. Gandhi was not immune to the temptations and missteps of youth. In his teenage years, curiosity led him into experimenting with small acts he later regretted. Smoking with friends, eating meat secretly despite his family's vegetarian traditions, and even taking a small amount of money from his brother's armlet to pay a debt. These actions filled him with guilt, so much so that he could not bear to keep them hidden. In an extraordinary act for a boy of his age, he wrote a confession to his father, admitting his wrongs and promising never to stray again. Instead of punishing him, his father, who was gravely ill at the time, silently read the note and wept. That moment, Gandhi would later say, etched into his heart the power of truth and forgiveness, more deeply than any book or sermon ever could. When Gandhi was 13 years old, his life took a turn that was common in India at that time, but would feel strange to many today. He was married. His bride, Kasturba Mukherjee, was also just 13. The marriage was arranged by their families, as was the custom. Gandhi would later reflect critically on child marriage, acknowledging that at such a young age, neither he nor Kasturba understood what marriage truly meant. In those early years, their relationship was filled with immaturity, moments of jealousy and misunderstandings. But over time, Kasturba would become one of Gandhi's greatest partners and supporters in life's work. As Gandhi moved into his late teens, the question of his future began to take shape. His family wanted him to follow in his father's footsteps and take up a respected position in public service. But the path to such a career was not straightforward. At 18, Gandhi left India for the first time to travel to London, England, to study law. The journey was not just a physical one, it was a leap into a completely different world. Before leaving, he made a vow to his mother, witnessed by a Jain monk, that he would abstain from meat, alcohol, and women while abroad. London in the late 19th century was bustling, industrial, and vastly different from the quiet streets of Porbandar. Gandhi struggled at first to adapt. His clothes, manners, and even his vegetarian diet set him apart from his peers. Determined to fit in, he tried to refine himself. He took lessons in French, dancing, and public speaking, though he was painfully shy in front of audiences. The vegetarian vow he had taken led him to explore London's small but vibrant vegetarian community, where he began reading about diet, health, and ethics. More importantly, it introduced him to writers like Henry Salt, who connected vegetarianism to nonviolence and compassion for all living beings. These ideas planted seeds that would later grow into Gandhi's broader philosophy. In London, Gandhi was also introduced to religious and philosophical works outside of Hinduism. He read the Bible, especially the Sermon on the Mount, and found himself deeply moved by Jesus' teachings about turning the other cheek and loving one's enemies. He read about Buddhism, Islam, and the works of great Western thinkers. This period became a time of quiet intellectual awakening. Though he was far from the activist he would one day become, the foundation for his life's mission was being laid. After 3 years, Gandhi completed his law studies and qualified as a barrister. In 1891, he returned to India, eager to begin his career. But things did not go as planned. His initial attempts at practicing law in Bombay were discouraging. He was too shy to cross-examine witnesses and too inexperienced to attract clients. Just as doubt was beginning to creep in, an opportunity came from an Indian firm in Porbandar that needed a representative in South Africa for a legal case. Gandhi accepted, thinking it would be a temporary assignment. But his time in South Africa would change the course of his life forever. When Gandhi arrived in Durban, South Africa in 1893, he encountered something that shook him to the core: blatant racial discrimination. One of the most infamous incidents happened just days after his arrival. While traveling by train to Pretoria, Gandhi was ordered to move from the first-class compartment despite holding a valid ticket, simply because he was Indian. When he refused, he was thrown off the train at the station in Pietermaritzburg. Left shivering in the cold night, that humiliation and injustice ignited something inside him. It was in that moment, he later said, that he resolved to fight against injustice, not with anger or violence, but with truth and moral courage. The night at Pietermaritzburg railway station was a turning point. Gandhi sat in the dim light, clutching his belongings, his mind racing. The cold wind bit at him, but the deeper chill was the sting of injustice. That moment became more than personal humiliation. It became a calling. He began to realize that discrimination was not an isolated incident. It was woven into the laws and customs of South Africa, especially against the Indian community and the Black African majority. Gandhi, who had come merely as a legal advisor for a commercial case, began to see that perhaps fate had brought him here for a far greater reason. In the weeks that followed, Gandhi witnessed more acts of racial prejudice. Indians could not walk on certain sidewalks. They had to carry passes to move around, and they were often insulted, beaten, or cheated without legal recourse. Something in him could no longer remain silent. When his 1-year legal contract was about to end, he decided to stay longer to help the Indian community organize themselves and fight for their rights. It was the first real step in his journey as a public leader. Gandhi began holding community meetings, writing petitions, and sending letters to newspapers. But he soon realized that conventional protests and legal appeals were not enough. The authorities responded with hostility, and the colonial government passed more discriminatory laws. In 1906, one such law in the Transvaal required all Indians to register with the government and carry identification at all times. Gandhi knew this was a deliberate attempt to humiliate the community. He proposed something radical, that they refuse to comply, even if it meant arrest and imprisonment. He called this new method of resistance Satyagraha, a Sanskrit word meaning true force or soul force. Satyagraha was unlike anything the world had seen before. It was a method of fighting injustice without violence, where the weapon was moral courage, and the goal was not to destroy the opponent, but to transform them. It required immense discipline, no retaliation, no hatred, and complete willingness to suffer the consequences of defying unjust laws. Gandhi and his followers began burning their registration certificates in public, defying orders, and marching peacefully in protest. Many were beaten by police, arrested, and thrown into jails. Gandhi himself was imprisoned multiple times. But instead of breaking their spirit, each act of repression only strengthened their unity. Over the next 2 decades, Gandhi became a respected leader in South Africa, admired even by some opponents for his honesty and steadfastness. He fought not just for Indian rights, but also spoke out against the oppression of Black South Africans. His work earned him both allies and enemies, but it established him as a man whose principles could not be bought or intimidated. By 1914, after years of struggle, the South African government agreed to several concessions, including the recognition of Indian marriages and the abolition of the most humiliating pass laws for Indians. Gandhi's mission in South Africa was complete, and he returned to India with a growing reputation as a man of unusual moral authority. When Gandhi arrived back in India in 1915, he was greeted with admiration and curiosity. People had heard of his victories in South Africa, but he was not yet deeply involved in Indian politics. The Indian National Congress, the main political organization fighting for independence, was still dominated by elites who preferred negotiations and petitions rather than mass mobilization. Gandhi spent his first year traveling across the country, quietly observing the lives of ordinary Indians, farmers, laborers, and the poor who bore the heaviest burdens under British rule. He dressed simply in a dhoti and shawl, lived frugally, and immersed himself in village life. It did not take long for Gandhi to see that India's fight for freedom had to include the voices of the masses, not just the educated elite. His first major intervention came in 1917 in Champaran, Bihar, where farmers were forced to grow indigo under exploitative conditions for British planters. Gandhi traveled there, investigated the situation, and encouraged farmers to peacefully resist the unjust system. The protests, though non-violent, were powerful enough to force the colonial authorities to make concessions. Soon after, in 1918, Gandhi supported striking mill workers in Ahmedabad, standing beside them in solidarity during a hunger strike until their demands were met. These early successes marked the beginning of Gandhi's leadership in India's independence movement. But his methods were not universally accepted. Many leaders thought nonviolence was too passive or too idealistic. Gandhi, however, was convinced that nonviolence was not weakness, it was strength of the highest order. He believed that violence might achieve quick victories, but would ultimately plant the seeds of future hatred and division. Nonviolence, he argued, allowed for justice without vengeance and for the possibility of reconciliation between oppressor and oppressed. The year 1919 brought a crisis that tested Gandhi's philosophy. The British passed the Rowlatt Act, allowing them to imprison people without trial, protests erupted across India, and Gandhi called for a nationwide hartal, a day of prayer and suspension of work. The demonstrations were largely peaceful, but in Amritsar, Punjab, the situation turned tragic. On April 13th, during a peaceful gathering at Jallianwala Bagh, British troops under General Dyer opened fire without warning, killing hundreds of unarmed men, women, and children. The massacre shocked the nation and the world. For Gandhi, it was a moment of deep sorrow, but also of renewed determination. He realized the full brutality of colonial rule and the urgency of mass resistance. In the years that followed, Gandhi led major campaigns against British rule, including the non-cooperation movement of the early 1920s. He urged Indians to boycott British goods, schools, and institutions, to spin their own cloth instead of buying imported textiles, and to embrace self-reliance. The spinning wheel became both a practical tool and a powerful symbol of resistance. Across the country, people began wearing khadi, the hand-spun cloth, as a mark of unity and defiance. Gandhi's approach inspired millions, but it also demanded sacrifice. When some protests turned violent, such as the Chauri Chaura incident in 1922, where a mob burned a police station and killed officers, Gandhi called off the entire movement, shocking his supporters. He would rather lose political momentum than compromise his commitment to nonviolence. For him, the means were as important as the ends. During this period, Gandhi also became a moral voice on issues beyond politics. He spoke against the caste system, especially the discrimination against so-called untouchables, whom he called Harijans, or children of God. He championed women's rights, encouraged education for all, and lived a life of simplicity to demonstrate that moral authority came not from wealth or power, but from truthfulness and service. By the late 1920s, the demand for full independence, or Purna Swaraj, was growing stronger. In 1930, Gandhi launched one of the most iconic acts of civil disobedience in history, the Salt March. The British had imposed a monopoly on salt, making it illegal for Indians to produce their own and taxing it heavily. Gandhi saw this as a perfect symbol of colonial exploitation because salt was a basic necessity for rich and poor alike. He announced that he would walk 240 miles from his ashram to the Arabian Sea, where he would make salt from seawater in defiance of the law. The Salt March captured the imagination of the nation and the world. Thousands joined Gandhi along the way, and when he finally bent down to collect a lump of salty mud at the seashore, it was more than an act. It was a declaration of freedom. The British arrested him and thousands of others, but the movement had already shaken the foundations of colonial control. Gandhi's imprisonment after the Salt March did little to slow the movement. If anything, it made him a global figure of resistance. International newspapers carried his image, frail in frame, dressed in simple white cloth, yet radiating a power that armies and governments found hard to suppress. The Salt March had struck a chord because it was not about grand speeches or armed struggle. It was about the dignity of the common man. The idea that no authority had the right to control even the simplest necessities of life. British government, under growing international pressure, eventually released Gandhi and entered into negotiations. In 1931, he traveled to London for the Second Roundtable Conference to discuss India's constitutional future. Gandhi, the sole representative of the Indian National Congress, walked the streets of London as a curiosity. Dressed in his plain dhoti amidst a sea of formal suits, he met ordinary dock workers, school children, and political leaders. Yet, Despite his charm and sincerity, the conference yielded little progress. The British were unwilling to grant full independence, and divisions within India itself complicated matters. Back home, Gandhi faced a new wave of repression. The British resumed arrests, and the struggle entered another phase of hardship. Gandhi's health, always fragile, suffered from repeated imprisonments and prolonged fasting. But his moral authority remained unshaken. For him, suffering for a just cause was not a burden, but a form of purification, an offering to truth. The 1930s were also a period when Gandhi deepened his campaigns for social reform. He intensified his fight against untouchability, traveling from village to village, urging temples to open their doors to all Hindus regardless of caste. He encouraged the Harijan community to pursue education, self-reliance, and dignity. This work was often met with hostility from orthodox groups, but Gandhi refused to yield, believing that true independence meant freedom not only from foreign rule, but also from internal oppression. When World War II broke out in 1939, Gandhi's principles were tested again. Britain declared India a participant in the war without consulting Indian leaders. The Congress Party, under Gandhi's influence, demanded that India be granted independence if it was to support the war effort. The British refused. Tensions escalated until, in 1942, Gandhi launched the Quit India movement, calling for an immediate end to British rule. The Quit India call electrified the nation, but also triggered the harshest crackdown yet. Gandhi, along with most Congress leaders, was arrested within hours. Protests erupted across the country. Students, workers, and peasants took to the streets in defiance. The British responded with mass detentions, censorship, and violent repression. Gandhi spent nearly 2 years in prison during this time, enduring personal tragedy as his wife, Kasturba, passed away in 1944 while still in detention. Her death was a blow from which Gandhi never fully recovered. By the end of the war, in 1945, the world had changed. Britain was exhausted economically and politically, and the demand for Indian independence could no longer be ignored. Negotiations resumed, but they were now overshadowed by deepening tensions between Hindus and Muslims. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, insisted on the creation of a separate Muslim state, Pakistan, while Gandhi and the Congress leadership hoped for a united India. Gandhi threw himself into efforts to bridge the divide, meeting leaders from all sides, traveling to riot-hit areas, and appealing to people's conscience. But the tide of communalism was strong, fueled by years of mistrust and political maneuvering. In 1947, Britain announced its plan to grant independence, but also to partition the country into India and Pakistan. Gandhi was deeply saddened by this decision, fearing that it would sow seeds of hatred for generations to come. Still, he accepted the political reality, choosing to focus on preventing violence during the transition. Independence came on August 15, 1947. While the nation celebrated, Gandhi was in Bengal, not in Delhi for the grand ceremonies. He was fasting and working to calm communal riots that had engulfed Calcutta. His presence had a miraculous effect in some areas. Hindu and Muslim leaders came together to honor his appeals for peace, but elsewhere, the violence continued, claiming hundreds of thousands of. In the months after independence, Gandhi became a moral compass in a nation torn between joy and grief. He fasted to protest communal killings, walked among refugees, and pleaded for tolerance. But his stance also made him a target for extremists on all sides. Some Hindus saw him as too conciliatory toward Muslims. Some Muslims believed he had failed to stop partition. On January 30th, 1948, Gandhi walked to a prayer meeting in Delhi. Frail but determined, he leaned on the arms of his grandnieces. The crowd parted to let him pass, many bowing in respect. As he raised his hands in blessing, a man stepped forward, bowed, and then fired 3 bullets into Gandhi's chest. Gandhi fell, uttering, "Hey Ram," as life left his body. The news stunned the world. Leaders from every corner of the globe paid tribute to the man who had fought the might of empire with nothing but the power of truth and non-violence. In India, millions wept openly, feeling orphaned without his guiding presence. But Gandhi's legacy was not bound to his mortal life. His teachings of Satyagraha inspired movements for civil rights and freedom across continents. From Martin Luther King Jr. struggle against racial segregation in America to Nelson Mandela's fight against apartheid in South Africa. His belief that the means must match the ends, that love could overcome hatred, and that one person's moral courage could awaken an entire people continues to echo in history. Gandhi once said, "My life is my message." Indeed, his life, rooted in humility, service, and unwavering commitment to truth, remains a testament to what one determined soul can achieve. He left no wealth, no grand titles, only a path for humanity to follow. The path of nonviolence, compassion, and the relentless pursuit of justice.